What if the most terrifying crime didn't begin with a gunshot, but with silence? Imagine walking into work every night, believing routine is your shield. Same doors, same lights, same quiet hum of machines counting money that isn't yours. And somewhere in the shadows, for more than a year, unseen eyes are watching your every move, learning when you breathe, when you relax, when you're most vulnerable. This story began long before January 17th, 1950. It began with obsession. And at the center of it was Anthony Pino, a Boston career criminal whose life never brushed greatness, only survival. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He was patient. And patience would become the most dangerous weapon in this crime. Alongside him was a tight-knit crew of seasoned thieves, men who understood discipline, silence, and the value of waiting. These were not impulsive criminals. These were men who treated crime like profession. For 18 months, they studied the Brink's armored car depot on Prince Street as if it were a living organism. They memorized routines the way predators memorize prey. They learned when the building held the most money, which employees worked with shifts, who hesitated at doors, who moved quickly, who lingered. They noted the alarms, the locks, the blind spots, every weakness hidden beneath the illusion of security. The victims, though they didn't yet know it, were ordinary working people, Brink's employees, men earning honest paychecks, many supporting families, trusting that reinforced doors and company procedures would protect them. They joked with coworkers. They followed rules. They believed the systems around them worked. That belief would be shattered. What makes this crime chilling isn't just what was taken, but how deeply the robbers infiltrated the space without anyone noticing. At some point during their surveillance, members of the crew managed to steal copies of the depot's alarm plans. Not smash and grab theft, quiet, surgical, invisible. Even more disturbing, they returned the plans after copying them. No broken locks, no raised alarms, no warning that the heart of Brink security had already been compromised. This wasn't desperation. This was control. Psychologically, the planning reveals something darker than greed. It shows compartmentalization, the ability to emotionally detach from future victims while preparing to terrorize them. The crew didn't see employees as people. They saw obstacles, timetables, variables to manage. This kind of thinking is common in organized criminal behavior, where moral boundaries erode slowly, replaced by justification. No one will get hurt. It's just money. But that belief ignores the reality of fear, because even without bloodshed, what was coming would leave lasting scars. As months passed, the plan hardened. Every man had a role. Every movement was rehearsed mentally. Clothing was selected not for style, but anonymity. Dark coats, chauffeur caps, gloves, rubber-soled shoes to silence footsteps. Masks to erase faces. They prepared ropes and tape, not yet touching the people they would soon restrain, but already imagining it. By the time January arrived, the crime was no longer an idea. It was inevitable. The men were ready. The building was vulnerable, and the employees inside had no idea that the safest place they knew had already been conquered, long before the door would ever open. January 17th, 1950 arrived like any other winter night in Boston. Cold, unremarkable, routine. Inside the Brink's armored car depot on Prince Street, employees settled into the familiar rhythm of their shift. Money was being counted. Paperwork was stacked. The air smelled faintly of ink, dust, and metal. There was no sense of danger, only habit. That sense of normalcy was a final illusion. Just after closing time, the men arrived. They did not rush. They did not shout. They moved with a calm precision that made what followed even more terrifying. Dressed almost identically, dark navy coats, chauffeur-style caps pulled low, gloves tied around their hands, rubber-soled shoes absorbing every footstep. They looked like authority figures, not intruders. Their faces were hidden behind masks, erasing identity, humanity, and hesitation. The first moment of terror came not with violence, but with confusion. Employees barely had time to react before they were surrounded. Guns appeared, not fired, but unmistakably real. Cold metal pressed into backs. Commands were delivered in firm, controlled voices. There was no chaos, no panic-driven shouting, just domination. One by one, the workers were forced to the floor, hands bound tightly with rope, mouths sealed with adhesive tape. The tape pulled painfully at skin, muffling breath and sound, reducing grown men to helpless silence. Fear became physical. Heartbeats thundered in ears. Muscles trembled against restraints that wouldn't give. The floor was cold, unforgiving, and smelled faintly of dust and oil. Every second stretched unbearably long. No one knew if a wrong movement would mean death. The robbers said little, but their confidence spoke louder than threats. They had done this before, at least in their minds, 1,000 times. Psychologically, this was where the true violence occurred. The employees were not just restrained. They were stripped of control, dignity, and certainty. Even without bloodshed, the trauma was profound. Studies of armed robberies show that victims often experience long-term anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance. In that moment, each worker was trapped in the terrifying question, will I leave this building alive? While the employees lay immobilized, the robbers moved to the counting room, the heart of the depot. This was the space they had studied for a year and a half. They knew exactly where to go, exactly what to take, exactly how long they had. Canvas bags were open and filled with mechanical efficiency. Cash, more than $1.2 million, was scooped up in thick bundles, the weight of it bending the bags. Checks, money orders, and securities worth another $1.5 million followed. The sound of paper shifting, drawers opening, bags being dragged across the floor filled the room. A mundane noise masking one of the largest thefts in American history. In less than 30 minutes, it was over. 14 heavy canvas bags were carried out, each one representing shattered trust and unimaginable loss. The robbers left behind almost nothing. A chauffeur's cap dropped in haste, lengths of rope, strips of tape. No fingerprints, no names, no faces. Then silence. The door closed. Footsteps faded. The building, moments earlier under total control, was suddenly empty again. Minutes later, employees began to free themselves. Fingers numb, wrists burning, mouths raw from tape being torn away. Some were shaking uncontrollably. Others were eerily calm, shock already setting in. When the alarm was finally raised, the realization hit with crushing force. Over $2.7 million was gone, roughly $35 million today. But the money was only part of the damage. That night planted something far more enduring. Fear, disbelief, and a haunting awareness that the safeguards meant to protect them had failed completely. For law enforcement, it marked the beginning of a relentless pursuit. For the criminals, it felt like victory. For the victims, it was a moment their sense of safety was stolen, something no amount of money could ever replace. And as police sirens cut through the Boston night, one question echoed louder than any alarm. How could a crime this massive leave behind almost nothing at all? By the time police arrived, the Brink's depot was no longer a crime scene in motion. It was a hollowed-out shell. Employees sat on the floor or leaned against walls, wrists raw and swollen where rope had bitten into skin. Tape lay discarded in twisted strips, some still bearing the imprint of lips and stubble. The smell of fear lingered, sweat, dust, metal, and the sharp tang of adhesive. Voices trembled as statements were taken. Hands shook as cigarettes were lit and relit. The question everyone kept asking, how did this happen, had no answer. Outside, the Boston night offered nothing back. The robbers were already gone. They had loaded the 14 canvas bags into a stolen truck, its engine swallowing the sound of their escape. There was no high-speed chase, no witnesses pointing frantically down the street, no gunfire echoing through alleyways. The city moved on, unaware that one of the largest robberies in American history had just slipped quietly into the dark. From an investigative standpoint, the absence was terrifying. Detectives and FBI agents combed the depot inch by inch. Floors were photographed, walls dusted, every object cataloged. Yet what they found was maddeningly sparse. A chauffeur's cap, a few lengths of rope, scraps of adhesive tape. No usable fingerprints. No shoe impressions clear enough to trace. No vehicle left behind. It was as if the man had evaporated. This was not luck. It was preparation. The stolen truck was later discovered dismantled, its parts scattered and discarded across multiple locations, an intentional act designed to erase forensic trails. Serial numbers were gone. Paint flakes meant nothing. Each component was a dead end, forcing investigators to start over again and again. Psychologically, this stage of the crime reveals a deeper motive than money alone: the desire for invisibility. Criminal profilers note that offenders who plan escapes as meticulously as the crime itself often exhibit high levels of control-oriented thinking. They aren't chasing adrenaline. They are chasing mastery, the satisfaction of outsmarting systems, institutions, and authority. The Brink's crew didn't just want the money, they wanted to disappear with it. And they succeeded. In the days that followed, headlines exploded. The public was stunned. How could over $2.7 million vanish from a heavily secured facility without a single suspect? Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered the crime was an inside job. Others believed organized crime syndicates were involved. Tips flooded in from across the country, each one promising, each one ultimately hollow. For the employees, the aftermath was deeply personal. Many struggled to return to work. Loud noises triggered panic. Night shifts became unbearable. Some replayed the moment guns appeared over and over in their minds, wondering if a wrong breath or sudden movement might have ended their lives. The fact that no one had been physically injured offered little comfort. Trauma doesn't require blood. Law enforcement felt a different kind of pressure. Every passing day emboldened the perpetrators and eroded public confidence. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it seemed the criminals had committed the perfect crime. Behind closed doors, investigators worried about one ticking clock above all: the statute of limitations. Time wasn't just passing, it was actively working against them. And somewhere hidden in basements, apartments, or buried caches, the stolen money sat untouched, because spending it too quickly would mean exposure. That restraint was chilling. It meant the men responsible were disciplined enough to wait again. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the Brink's robbery transformed from a crime into a legend built on silence, on patience, on the terrifying possibility that some crimes are planned so well they may never truly be undone. As the initial shock faded, a more corrosive feeling took its place: uncertainty. Weeks after the robbery, the Brink's depot was back in operation, but nothing felt the same. Employees avoided eye contact when discussing that night. Some refused to work late shift again. Others carried the fear quietly, internalizing it, replaying the moment the guns appeared and wondering how close they had come to never going home. The building stood, but its sense of safety was permanently broken. For investigators, the case became an obsession. The FBI and Boston police chased hundreds of leads, each one promising salvation from failure. Anonymous tips poured in. Calls from people claiming neighbors suddenly bought cars, paid off debts, vanished altogether. Informants whispered about buried money, waterfront dumps, and secret vaults. Some swore the cash was hidden near Boston Harbor, sealed in barrels beneath the mud. Others insisted the thieves had fled the country. None of it held. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Locations yielded nothing. Suspects had airtight alibis or couldn't be placed near Prince Street that night. Slowly, painfully, investigators realized what they were facing: a crime designed not just to succeed, but to endure. The psychological strain began to show on both sides. For law enforcement, this was a rare and deeply unsettling scenario. The robbers had done everything right. They hadn't talked. They hadn't spent recklessly. They hadn't bragged. They hadn't turned on one another, at least not yet. Profilers understood that this level of silence required discipline and fear. Fear of prison, fear of betrayal, fear of losing everything if even one man slipped. But silence is heavy. Experts note that long-term secrecy places immense psychological pressure on offenders. Money becomes useless if it can't be spent freely. Relationships strain under hidden tension. Paranoia sets in. Every knock at the door feels final. Every newspaper headline feels personal. The longer the case dragged on, the more investigators believed the criminals would eventually crack. Not because of evidence, but because of human weakness. Meanwhile, the statute of limitations loomed closer. 6 years. That was the window. If arrests weren't made in time, the men responsible would walk free forever, their crime legally untouchable. The knowledge gnawed investigators, turning each dead end into a personal failure. Careers, reputations, and public trust were on the line. The community felt it too. Boston residents followed the case like a dark serial drama. Conversations drifted back to the robbery again and again. How could such a massive theft remain unsolved? Some admired the criminals in hushed tones, mistaking precision for brilliance. Others were furious, seeing the case as proof that systems meant to protect them could be breached without consequence. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The men who committed the robbery were no longer unified by triumph. Time erodes loyalty. Money creates resentment. And the very patience that allowed them to succeed now became a source of bitterness. One man, in particular, began to feel wronged, cut off from his share, powerless, trapped in a situation he could no longer control. And it would be that fracture, not a fingerprint, not a witness, that would finally breathe life back into a case many believed was already dead. The crack didn't come with sirens or a sudden discovery of buried money. It came quietly, through resentment. While investigators chased shadows, one member of the Brink's crew was already unraveling from the inside. Joseph O'Keefe was not living freely with stolen millions. He was behind bars, serving time for an entirely different burglary. And prison has a way of sharpening injustice until it becomes unbearable. O'Keefe had trusted the group. Before his incarceration, he had left his share of the Brink's money with the others for safekeeping, believing loyalty would protect him. But months turned into years, and the money never came. No visits, no envelopes, no quiet assurances that his future was secure. From a prison cell, he listened as life moved on without him, while the wealth he helped steal remained out of reach. Psychologically, this is where the crime shifted. Experts describe betrayal among criminal groups as one of the strongest triggers for cooperation with authorities. Not guilt, not remorse, anger. O'Keefe felt abandoned, used, erased. The discipline that kept the group silent began to rot under the weight of resentment. And resentment, unlike fear, demands release. He complained, at first, to fellow inmates, then to acquaintances. Finally, loud enough that the complaints reached ears trained to listen, law enforcement. Investigators noticed something different this time. The details, the specificity, the consistency. This wasn't a rumor. This was a man talking about money he should have. Money tied to a crime no one could solve. Slowly, methodically, the FBI began rebuilding the case. Not from the crime scene, but from human behavior. They tracked relationships, watched movements, monitored spending patterns that suddenly made sense in hindsight. Men who had once lived modestly now had unexplained financial stability, homes, businesses, comfort without clear income. None of it was flashy enough to raise alarms alone. Together, it told a story. And then came the most damning discovery of all. Some of the stolen money still existed, hidden, forgotten, tucked away in places meant to be temporary, but had become permanent. Small amounts surfaced, enough to confirm the impossible. The Brink's money hadn't vanished. It had simply been waiting. For investigators, the emotional shift was palpable. Hope returned, but so did urgency. The statute of limitations was dangerously close. Every move had to be perfect, every arrest timed, every charge precise. There would be no second chance. If they acted too soon, the case could collapse. If they waited too long, justice would evaporate. For the perpetrators, paranoia exploded. They sensed it, the subtle changes, the questions, the tightening circle. Years of silence now felt fragile. Trust dissolved into suspicion. Who had talked? Who would talk next? The psychological burden became unbearable. Sleep fractured, tempers flared, mistakes multiplied. The perfect crime was no longer perfect. It was bleeding from the inside. And as January 1956 approached, law enforcement prepared to make their move. One that would decide whether the Brink's robbery would remain a legend or finally become a conviction. January 1956 arrived, carrying a deadline that could not be missed. For nearly 6 years, the Brink's robbery had mocked law enforcement. A crime so meticulously planned it seemed to exist outside the reach of justice. Now, with the statute of limitations days away, the FBI moved with controlled urgency. There would be no dramatic raids splashed across headlines. No warnings. No hesitation. The arrests came swiftly. One by one, members of the crew were taken into custody. Doors opened to badges. Quiet homes filled with sudden tension. The men who had lived for years believing they had beaten the system now faced the reality they had worked so hard to avoid: exposure. By the time the initial wave ended, 6 men were under arrest. More followed as the net widened. For the perpetrators, the psychological collapse was immediate. Years of secrecy offered no protection once the truth surfaced. The same discipline that kept them silent now worked against them. No rehearsed alibis could withstand the web of evidence built from surveillance, recovered money, and testimony. The money they had guarded so carefully became the very thing that betrayed them. The trial that followed was relentless. Prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece, reconstructing a crime that had left almost no physical evidence at the scene. They presented timelines, associations, financial anomalies, and witness statements that revealed how deeply coordinated the robbery had been. Jurors listened as the myth of the perfect crime disintegrated under the weight of human error and betrayal. Joseph O'Keefe's role loomed large, not as a hero, not as a repentant man, but as a symbol of how greed fractures loyalty. His resentment, fueled by years of perceived injustice, became the catalyst that ended the silence. For the Brink's employees, the trial reopened wounds. They were asked to relive the terror of that night, testifying about guns in their faces, restraints cutting into their skin, the suffocating fear of not knowing whether they would survive. Some spoke calmly, others broke down. The courtroom became a place where trauma resurfaced, undeniable and raw. In October 1956, the verdicts came. 8 men were convicted. The sentences were severe: life imprisonment for robbery, compounded by additional years for conspiracy and breaking and entering. Appeals followed, but none succeeded. The Massachusetts Supreme Court denied relief. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. The case was over, legally, but justice came with an unsettling footnote. Despite convictions, most of the money was never recovered. Millions remained unaccounted for, lost, hidden, spent, or buried beyond discovery. For the public, it left an uncomfortable truth. Even when justice prevails, it is often incomplete. The men were punished. The victims were acknowledged. But the full story remained just out of reach. And that lingering absence of money, of certainty, of closure would ensure the Brink's robbery lived on, not just as a solved crime, but as a haunting reminder how close evil can come to getting away with everything. When the courtroom emptied and sentences were handed down, the Brink's robbery should have ended as a closed case. On paper, justice had been served. The men responsible were imprisoned. The mystery was technically solved. But emotionally, psychologically, and culturally, the crime never really ended. For the Brink's employees, the verdicts did not erase what had been taken from them. Many carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Some never returned to similar work. Others lived with persistent anxiety, jumping at sudden noises, mistrusting locked doors, replaying the moment guns appeared in their minds decades later. The robbery didn't just steal money, it redefined their sense of safety. Even years later, some struggle to explain why a crime without bloodshed left such deep scars. But terror doesn't need a body count to be permanent. Families felt it too. Spouses watched loved ones withdraw. Children grew up sensing fear they couldn't name. The night of January 17, 1950, became an unspoken fracture, something everyone knew about but no one fully healed from. For the community, the Brink's robbery left behind a more abstract wound. Boston had witnessed the unsettling truth that order could be dismantled quietly, methodically, by men who looked ordinary. There was no cinematic chaos, just planning, patience, and silence. The idea that such a massive crime could unfold without warning reshaped how people thought about security, trust, and authority. Some admired the precision. Others were disturbed by how close the criminals came to escaping forever. Experts often point to the Brink's robbery as proof that no crime is truly perfect. Not because evidence will always surface, but because people inevitably fail themselves. And still, questions linger. Did more money exist than authorities ever discovered? Did someone die knowing where a hidden fortune lay? Were there accomplices who were never named? How many people unknowingly passed through lives quietly funded by stolen cash? These unanswered threads keep the story alive. The Brink's robbery became legend, retold in books, documentaries, and film, not because it was violent, but because it exposed something unsettling about human nature. How calm, careful planning can be just as terrifying as chaos, and how even the most meticulous crimes leave behind echoes that never fully fade. So the final question isn't how the money was stolen. It's this: what would you do if patience, silence, and loyalty could make you rich, but destroy everyone else in the process? Share your thoughts, theories, or unanswered questions in the comments. And if you want more deeply researched, emotionally driven true crime stories, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because some crimes may be solved, but their shadows never disappear.